partnerships at OpenAI, a leading AI company, the home of ChatGPT or GPT-4, maybe GPT-5 soon. Maybe you'll let us know when that's coming.
See. Yeah.
Prior to joining OpenAI, Katrina served in a number of roles in the Defense Department and the intelligence community, including most recently as Chief of Staff to the Secretary of the Army, and prior to that, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, SOLIC, for those of you who don't know. That's the cool part of the Department of Defense. She also served a variety of roles when we worked together at the National Counterterrorism Center, the Justice Department, and ODNI. Paul is the Senior Vice President and Head of Global Public Policy for the Software and Information Industry Association. Prior to joining SIAA, Paul served as the Director of Research and Analysis and the Senior Legal and Strategy Advisor for the congressionally mandated National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which focused, among other things, on U.S. competition with China in the era of AI. So I'm going to get started with some questions. We'll have a casual fireside chat here. Please grab some food and coffee. But as you're hearing the conversation, please get your questions ready, because towards the end of the last 15 or 20 minutes, we'll have a chance for you to ask questions of our panelists. So let's jump right in. So look, there's been a lot of talk, Katrina, about the potential threats that AI may pose to our nation and the globe. A lot of talk about the potential negative implications. Workforce questions about whether some have even gone so far as to say we should treat AI like nuclear weapons or pandemics, right? There's a number of experts that signed a letter saying that. How do you see the current state of AI's impact on our economic and national security here in the U.S.?
So it's interesting that this is the starting place, because just very recently I was at a dinner with a bunch of AI folks who work on AI in the federal government, AI experts, and it started much the same way. Straight out of the gate, let's talk about risk. And in fact, at the dinner, we introduced ourselves and went around this round table, each person saying, what is the thing about AI that keeps you up at night? And after listening to everybody kind of go through it, I answered, and I'll say the same thing here. What keeps me up at night is not actually the boogeyman of what we can get wrong about AI. We should absolutely be clear-eyed about that. I am not diminishing that in any way. And we have a lot of people inside of my organization, but I also know at many of the other leading AI companies that are thinking about these questions. Yeah. And in fact, part of the reason that I'm here and why OpenAI supports, participating in forums like this one is because it is so important for us to engage with government, with academia, and with the public on these issues. But the thing that keeps me up at night is actually that we will not embrace this technology fast enough, that we will allow concern about all the things that could go wrong, as we often do in Washington, limit our ability to act in ways that our adversaries don't. Yeah. And one of the things that I see a lot in the role that I sit in right now is how much the rest of the world is pursuing aggressively engagement with AI companies, and how different that is from what we're seeing from the government in this space, from the U.S. government. And so what worries me is actually that we're going to not move fast enough, and then we're going to lose the first mover advantage that we have as kind of being at the leading edge of this technology.
Yeah. Look, I love that, because I really do believe that AI has the potential to really be a tide that raises all boats. And yes, there are things to be concerned about. We should think about trust, safety, and security, but I really do see massive advantage. And with us leading out front on this, right, we want to maintain that technological edge. So I do want to ask you, though, about what you think the government's doing. But before I do that, Paul, I want to ask you, there's been a lot of talk about AI regulation here in Congress, up on the Hill, and in the Senate office buildings, here on the House side. Even the Republican chair of the AI task force, who we had an event with earlier last month, in talking about the benefits AI can bring to cybersecurity, said, look, even the House Republicans are thinking about how we might regulate AI. So talk to us about how we should think about this in the context of what Katrina just raised, that if we don't adopt fast enough, or we overregulate, might we lose the advantage we have today? I mean, you've already got Europe, right? They've got the AI Act. It's got a lot of regulation in it. Where do you see this going in the U.S., and how concerned should we be about adoption, regulation, and innovation?
It's a great question, and I think we have to look at this in different sectors. I think that the demands in the national security sector are going to be different than the demands in other areas of our society, and the sorts of guardrails that we may want are going to be different as well. I think Congress is proceeding in exactly the right way right now. I think
Something you never hear. Congress is doing the right thing.
Exactly the right thing.
I mean,
said.
that is.
the Congress is taking a careful approach, and the Senate has been educating itself. The House is educating itself. The leaders of the new House task force are really knowledgeable about AI.
Jay Obernolte and from California, Ted Lieu. Right?
Ted Lieu,
Yeah.
right. They've been very thoughtful about AI for some time. Obernolte studied AI. The Senate did a series of AI forums last year, as many in this room probably know, to educate the senators, and we're expecting a report to come out soon that will lay out something like a sector approach to AI regulation, where we don't need the same sort of guardrails and checks everywhere. And the people who are really expert in a certain area are not going to be the same. So the Department of Transportation is going to know a lot more about automotive safety than the Department of Defense. But the needs in the national security community are really unique. And I think that we really need to be promoting innovation. And I see that energy in Congress. There's a new bill that was dropped last week. I will forget the name, but it's really about promoting the different types of things that we need in terms of R&D, advanced capabilities, working with allies and partners on standards, and trying to promote innovation among U.S. companies, in the laboratories, and so on. And that's the kind of thing that we need. I agree with Katrina. The national security community can't move fast enough to adopt AI. I think that they've done a lot of really good work, DoD, the intelligence community, at building those guardrails, the ethical standards. But the world is moving ahead fast, and we need to be able to address concerns around data, lots and lots of data, and how we can make the most use of it. as
Can I
fast as
make one interjection
Yeah,
there?
please.
Because I do want to clarify that when I am saying that I think we need to move fast and adopt this technology,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that I'm saying we need to do that for all possible use cases.
Yeah.
Because there are use cases, first of all, that the technology is not ready to be involved with
Like
at
what?
all. I mean, well, what the technology is really good at today
tell us
is things that have to do with organizing and structuring language. It's very good at just language translation. It's very good at, organizing data. It can do various coding tasks. Like, there are things that it's really good at. One of my favorite uses that I kind of use it for all the time is it really helps me structure the flow of an argument. So it doesn't write.
The lawyer thing.
Yes.
We've got 3 lawyers on this
I
panel,
know,
by the way.
I
so,
know.
right.
But sometimes when I'm wrestling with how I want to say a thing, I will just put it into ChatGPT, and then often I won't want to use the actual words that it gives me.
But the thought.
The organization of it often gives me what I need. And to be honest with you, with the capabilities that are going to come online later this year, I think I'll probably end up using what it gives me in the words as well. But
You heard it here first. A little bit of insight into what's going on.
I think that you're going to see capability jumps, not just from OpenAI, but from a number of AI companies this year that will have massive potential for economic impact, but also massive importance for the national security community. And so what I want to be heard as saying is not, let's go straight into the deep end of the pool and immediately start using this for all our most sensitive activities. I am not saying that. In fact, quite on the contrary, I would advise against it. What I am saying, though, is that I can't tell you how often I go into a meeting with a senior government official who's responsible for either acquiring or building policy guardrails around this type of technology, and I ask them, what's the last time you used AI to help you to do something? And they're, I don't have an account. Like, I'm not actually using this technology. It happens all the time.
Wait, the people who are actually doing the policy around this?
Just officials in general. I mean, I think that, it's a conservative approach. I mean, I've worked in government almost all of my career, and it's a place where it's a trust but verify culture, It's not a place where you're going to go in and just start typing out stuff. People are worried about, well, am I allowed to use this? And what I tell people is, look, don't go to the deep end of the pool. Start with the easy stuff. Start with you're writing an email and you want to structure it and it's on the unclass side, figure out how it can help you for the low stakes cases that I would describe as toil reduction. And then begin to allow your imagination to go, where could this take you in some of the more complicated use cases that require more of that governance and structure. But if you're not using it to just make your life simpler, like when you personally are going on vacation, then
You're failing.
You're not understanding what it can do.
Yeah, I mean, there is tremendous power. I've told my staff who's in the room that everyone needs an account. We'll pay for it, and everyone needs to use it to do your daily work. It is a boost up. If you're not using it, you're falling behind because everybody else is using it, and you're just doing stuff the old way, right? If you're still going on a search engine and putting your search terms in, you're failing.
I went to my family vacation this year. We went to Egypt, the Mulligan family, and I didn't use any other tool. I just used ChatGPT. Like I'd be in, the Valley of the Kings, and I would be like, tell me what the history is of this thing that I'm looking at. And it really does bring things to life in a way. And so it doesn't have to be sensitive. It doesn't even have to be for the purpose of your work.
Yeah.
You need to become fluent in what the tools are capable of in order to be able to understand that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the potential is extraordinary. I mean, we know that government is often slow to adopt new technologies. And what we're talking about here, what I think Katrina is getting at, is fundamentally changing the way you do your work, your everyday work.
Imagine constituent responses, like never having to rewrite, do congressional mail. I mean, you could have AI help you. I mean, it'd be huge.
You could respond to a volume like this.
Yeah.
Thank
you for your interest in-
having that, digital assistant with you at all times, that's going to be something that's going to take some time to deal with. And I do a lot of work also in the education environment, and the amount of energy right now that's being put into try to teach teachers about how to use AI tools is extraordinary. I don't think we have that happening at the government level. But people need to understand how to incorporate this into their daily lives, not just into the big mission sensitive.
So this is really troubling. Like, how do we do that? How do we break? So part of this, I got to believe, is part of what you say is the small C conservative government culture, right? The risk aversion, right? But of course, that's not always true of the government. There are pockets of the government,
Absolutely.
right, in the intelligence community, that are very forward-leaning and very, the special operations forces that you worked with, right, that are very lean forward and edgy. There are also times in history when, the space race, where the government incentivized internally, right, taking risks, and we weren't afraid to lose a bunch of rockets, right, in order to get one up in the sky and up to the moon, right? Is there a way in this domain to sort of break us free and get the government to learn, to adopt, to try, to test in a way that they either feel is safe or is incentivized by the structures that are around them?
So I can tell you how I'm thinking about, so this is a big part of what I do at OpenAI. Like my job is to figure out how we develop policy internally around how we're gonna allow our tools to be used in the defense and intelligence sectors, but also how to figure out how to create the right kinds of partnerships. And some of that is about getting the government ready for what's coming.
Yeah.
We firmly believe that the time to have these conversations is now, before the tools become even more capable.
Yeah.
So that we can do the crawl and walk that is really essential before you start to run. Where I try to take the conversation is going back to what I said before, toil reduction. Like the way I think about what AI is doing is it's fundamentally changing our relationship with information. Much in the same way that the internet did, some 25 years ago or however long. When I think about, I'm going to date myself, but it's fine. I'm a very old lady. When I think about how my relationship with information when I was, in elementary school all the way up until high school, if I wanted to write a paper, my option was to go to an encyclopedia or a physical library and look at an actual book.
And go to the card catalog.
The card catalog, yes, and I had an encyclopedia set at my house and all of that pre-internet, and then the internet came along and it fundamentally changed how we get information in a million ways, and it changed how we do our work, but it also totally changed how we live our regular lives outside of work. And I would argue that figuring out how it works in your life is as important, and we need the national security community to do that because that's where the best thinking about what its potential is going to come from. But inside of government, what the types of partnerships that we're exploring are what I call they're low threat, high reward use cases. Things like, how do we make it easier to figure out what hiring authority you can use to hire someone? Anybody who's been in the federal government knows that, and if you've been a supervisor, I cannot tell you how much of my time I've spent trying to find a creative way to lawfully hire a person that I knew was really good for a job. And, we can ingest, totally publicly available HR policy data and create a GPT that you can ask it, like, I've got a person at this level, they've got this level of disability, or they're a veteran or whatever, and, what are my options? And it will literally just tell you something, and it will abbreviate something that would have taken you 4 hours. Now, that is not in the category of really, sexy, defense use cases,
Right.
but it is totally something that if you can just reduce toil in the government, you can free up resources that will make your existing workforce so much more effective.
Government efficiency?
And-
what?
And the thing about it is that it also gets at the mission, right? When you see people burning out, when you have challenges like we had when I was in the Army, getting the recruitment to the level that you want to be at, people do this work because they're mission driven, and toil is what beats the mission out of them. If you just reduce that toil and make it easy, if you could, for example, and I'm just spitballing here, this is not a real use case that we are exploring, but I would be very interested in it. If we could just transform the way that we do training, all of those mandatory trainings, and so instead of having to sit there mindlessly thumbing through a PowerPoint, instead you
Unlike
actually
cybersecurity.
yeah, instead you actually engaged with a chatbot, and it asked you and it tested your knowledge in a way that met the requirements, but you could accomplish that task in such a shorter period of time and with something that didn't make you want to poke your own eye out.
So can I tell you a story?
That would be amazing.
So I'm teaching a class at George Mason Law School on the emerging law of AI, and I told all my students, you've got to use this. One of my students was using some of these apps to learn Spanish, right, for her family.
Mm-hmm.
She started having a conversation with ChatGPT and has dramatically increased her Spanish proficiency, just doing it in the car ride home from class.
The audio is going to be a game changer. I really do think that we're all going to be sitting in our,
I talk to
cars
Juniper all the
constantly.
time. I do it all the time. It's really, I have this odd relationship with my GPT where I learn a lot in the car ride home talking to GPT-4. So sorry, Paul, you were going to say.
No, I just want to add on to that. I mean, there's a lot of mundane tasks in government that can be expedited using AI, and that's a really interesting set of use cases. And to make the bureaucracy just more efficient, there is a lot of dull work that really doesn't require full human engagement. If we can get a tool that will help us with that, I think it's great.
It'll get them more excited.
And talk about language. Talk about government employees, military personnel who need to learn another language to go to another country.
Yeah.
It can be much more efficient to use these tools. I think, in the more mission critical areas, I sense that one of the challenges is finding the tools that actually meet what the government needs. And sometimes there's a mismatch, and there needs to be better communication.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about public-private partnerships. What does that really mean? And Katrina touched on this. And I think, if we're going to step back a couple meters, we need to rethink in this era what a public-private partnership means and how the government and industry actually work together. Industry to meet the needs of government, and not just those short-term needs, but what the government may need in the mid to long term. Government to be able to interact with industry in a way that they're able to convey what those needs potentially are.
So, Katrina, let's talk a little bit about, because you come out of the Department of Defense just recently, and Paula, you were on the National Security Commission on AI.
Yeah.
What are some of everyone thinks about the killer drones, right,
Yeah.
scenario of AI use and autonomous weapons, right? But that isn't probably the most common use case.
It is decidedly not the most common use case.
At all, right?
No.
And notwithstanding that news article that came out where some DoD officials suggested that they had run a war game and it had killed the drone operator, that was all not true. It was just a thought experiment, right?
Yeah.
So help us understand, what are putting aside sort of the pure toil reduction use cases, right? What's that middle ground between autonomous weapons over here, right, and toil reduction of HR hiring at DoD? What are these sort of somewhat sexy, interesting intelligence community DoD use cases that we could think about, and how might the adversary be thinking about these things as well?
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely need to be thinking about how our adversaries are thinking about and exploring the utility of tools like these. They will not be using our tools for those purposes. I can assure you of that. I'll give you some of the ones that sort of come to my mind. One is, in the intelligence domain, one of the things, and just in general, this isn't specific to the intelligence community by any means, but one of the most interesting things you can ask, ChatGPT to do or somebody else's tools to do is propose additional questions that you should be thinking about as you explore a topic. Like, these aren't, I don't think that we should go straight to thinking of, large language models as replacing human intelligence or anything. It's really about making us better and more efficient at what we do.
Yeah.
And like
Co-pilots.
it's that concept. I wouldn't use Copilot personally.
I wonder why.
No, but it's that idea of like having somebody who can ask you the brilliant question, or even just without even you prompting it, can suggest like, hey, it seems like you're focused on this line of inquiry. You should also consider these things. Another type of use case that I think about is reasoning, which is an area where I think we're going to see some progress over the next, certainly over the next year in terms of breakthroughs, is having some ability to understand what the information was upon which the response relies.
Oh, interesting. So you think there'll be more ability to understand that coming out of the?
I think there will be more ability to sort of see that, but also to think deeper. So like, imagine, I've sometimes heard our CEO, Sam Altman, talk about, one thing we know for sure is that when you apply more compute to a problem, when you increase, we think about it as scaling laws, but like when you increase the amount of compute that's available or the amount of data, you get higher quality answers. So what if you don't need that for all things? Like, what if you could have a button that you push that you say, I really want to, find the cure for cancer, and I'm willing to spend as much compute as it takes to get that, and you could get better responses, you would push that button, right? Like, if you had that ability. And so we may end up in a future universe where we have the ability to apply more compute resources or more thought time, go back and spend 3 hours and come back to me because I don't need to know this right this second. Like, I'm not
I'd rather
asking.
have a better answer.
I'd rather have a slower, better answer. So I can imagine use cases in those sorts of contexts that would be really intriguing. But what I would also say to the point about sort of governance and policy is that I think we collectively, private industry, the government, the public sector, like, we need to establish some policy guardrails around what we think is appropriate to be using these tools for and where it's less appropriate.
Interesting.
And the maturity of the technology itself is also a factor in that.
Yeah.
So what about that? I mean, Paul, how should we think about sort of policy guardrails? I mean, guardrails have been the hot topic
Totally.
in these AI fora that Senator Schumer's been running with Senators Young and Rounds and all the folks that have been involved in that effort. How should we think about policy guardrails, and do we worry? I mean, obviously, certain competitors of OpenAI have had challenges implementing their own guardrails internally and putting out and creating output that people roundly criticize them for. How should we think about? I'm not gonna.
Everybody has challenges in that space.
Right.
It's tricky.
To touch on that, but I just wanted to say something about the defense and the IC. I also used to be at the Pentagon as a lawyer. So,
yes, that's right, Deputy General Counsel, right?
Yeah. And I think where you're already seeing AI play a huge part is in the cyber realm.
Okay.
Around threat detection at scale, because there's also a lot of AI-enabled threats to the cyber realm. But so cybersecurity has been a really important part for years. A really important set of use cases for years at the NSA and other places. And in data analysis, I mean, just the heart of intelligence work, and including scouring open source intelligence. And that's where I think you're going to see a lot more progress in the near term. When it gets to, the sort of kind of kinetic challenges, it can be harder. Even, logistics. Logistics is a really important set of use cases for the Department of Defense and a place where AI can play an important role, including in working with allies. In NATO, for example, it's a at the heart of part of NATO's AI strategy. But to get to your question about guardrails, since the current state of the debate began probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it's always about how do we seize the potential of AI and address the challenges. What sort of guardrails do we need?
Yeah.
And I feel like, at least folks who are engaged in this in Washington and other capitals too have kind of come together around a set of the most high-risk use cases where we want extra guardrails.
Yeah.
And those are ones that tend to either involve safety and security or address individuals' rights.
Yeah.
And so housing, healthcare, employment, access to education, criminal justice, those are the highest risk use cases in Europe, in the United States, in Singapore, and other places. And I think, where that hits national security comes around the issue of surveillance and what sort of guardrails do we want? And that's a whole other can of worms. But I think with guardrails, it's important for companies to be responsible about AI. Companies who are developing AI, companies that are deploying AI. And this is something that can be really hard to do, especially when you're talking about startup companies. I think the more mature companies understand the need to do this because they've experienced it so many times in other ways. But it's not always the first focus of a smaller company, and there's a lot of smaller companies right now in the AI space. Not to dump on any of them, because I think some of them are actually doing it the right way. But there's got to be company responsibility, but there's also a role for government. I think it's hard to say overall what it should be, because I do think it depends sector by sector.
Yeah.
It's going to have to be flexible, whatever it is, because, if you just think about 2 years ago, it was unfathomable to us 2 years ago that we would be where we are in AI, and just in terms of, I think ChatGPT certainly exposed a whole, which ironically in OpenAI, we were a company of 200 when ChatGPT launched. It now has 100 million users on a daily basis, and that was not, people talk about it, and you can sort of go back to that time frame in old Slack messages and things, and people talked about it. It was a small research project that we were going to release, and so it was unfathomable what it was going to be. It's, I think, going to exceed its capacity this year again. And, I think we've got to build, there are two things we have to do in establishing guardrails. We absolutely need them, and government absolutely has a critically important role to play. They've got to be science informed. So we can't have it be just what sounds good to policy people. We have got to have people who understand the science of how these models work involved in those discussions. And it's got to be clear, but somehow flexible enough that it can adapt to what we can't yet see coming.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, I think people underestimate the role of the international standards organizations, which are absolutely critical. Things like ISO, IEC, IEEE, these are important organizations, and also the work of NIST. Perhaps nobody underestimates NIST anymore. NIST is now, the centerpiece of the United States' AI policy, but the NIST AI
almost
safety
overnight
consortium. They've been, that risk management framework is really important.
Fund them.
NSCAI,
They are very important.
We engage very closely with them. We do need to fund NIST. We need to support the work of the Safety Institute and the consortium. And these are the ways that not only do we create that safe, ecosystem and create the guardrails and encourage, incentivize companies to adopt them, but also the way we shape the AI landscape globally. And we can't underestimate that aspect of our national security.
Well, no, you mentioned startups and the need to ensure that startups are doing this in the right way as well. So in addition to my work at NSI, I'm a venture capital firm. We just announced, along with ForgePoint, Ernie Bios, who's here in the room, Capital, and a number of other national security investors, a set of investment principles around AI and investing in national security, investing in American and allied capabilities. Is there a role for investors to play as well in the space in addition to government and industry?
I think so. I think investors can be critical. And I think investors should be involved in policy too, because small companies, they're not going to have that element necessarily. And maybe getting a little outside of our topic, but I think that younger companies may not realize how much policy and regulation can affect them, can create market opportunities, or can require them to reconsider their business plan. And they're not necessarily going to have the personnel, and so for the investors to be engaged is really important.
And I'm going to come back. I'm going to come to the audience for questions here in just a few minutes. So, folks, have your questions ready. But I do want to follow up on a couple of things that you both talked about. One is this question about on guardrails, and I'll come back to how the IC and DoD might use it, because I think there's some interesting things to talk about, whether it's open source or otherwise. But on this guardrails question, there's been a lot of people who've said, look, the EU is already going down this road. They've got the EU AI Act. It's got a lot of regulation. It's got these structures for high risk and medium and low risk. If we don't move now, the US government, to regulate, the EU will do what they did in privacy and GDPR. They'll set the global standard. It'll be at a level we don't want it to be, and they'll beat us to the punch, and everyone will have to comply with that. Is that true? And if it is true, or even if it's not true, does that suggest we should perhaps not move as deliberately as we are, move faster, try to get regulatory sooner? I'm not a fan or a believer in that, but there's a lot of sort of theory around that. I think on the Hill there's a lot of pressure. Hey, the EU's already going, we need to go too. What do we think about that, Katrina?
I mean, as a general principle, I like to, I think that there is a role for government regulation here, and we at OpenAI have been really supportive of that, but also making, our technology, but also our experts available to inform, anybody who wants to talk to us. So we've done a ton of outreach in this space. I think that the underlying point that you're making is a valid one. I think there is absolutely a tension between moving fast and getting it right. And I'm not, a lot of business decisions are being made in this space. And I'm very new to thinking about business decisions at all, because I've been in government my whole career. But I absolutely see that there are trade-offs. If we make, I'll zoom out for a second and just say, our CEO has talked a lot, and you may have read in the paper about the need for vastly more compute than the world currently can produce. And
he's trying to raise a lot of money to sort of build that compute capacity.
He's trying to think about what the infrastructure requirements are going to be, and how to help the United States position itself to have the supply of compute that it's going to need. And those are questions with massive geopolitical impacts and things like that. What we do in the regulatory space has an influence on where you end up on some of these big questions. And I think it's why we've got to do both. We've got to move fast, and we've got to get it right. And the consequence of getting it wrong, I think, is a consequence that we don't want for the United States at all.
So Paul, what about that?
So I don't think the European AI Act is going to be GDPR number 2.
God forbid, right?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing here is a lot of countries that have advanced AI capabilities, at least in the private sector, have already moved forward on their own approaches to AI. The UK has staked out very clearly what it intends to do, which is a very light touch approach. Really great thinking coming out of the UK government about AI regulation. Japan, Singapore, other countries, China, they are pursuing approaches that are not the European AI Act. I don't think...
More aggressive? Less aggressive? Just different?
Less aggressive from a regulatory perspective. But maybe a better word than aggressive is less fixed. The European AI Act is fixed in a lot of ways. It's also going to require a massive bureaucracy to be able to monitor.
Very European.
And generate compliance assessments. And I think that other countries have experienced what that's like in privacy and realize that they're not going to be able to do the same sort of a thing. And
they don't want that.
They don't want it. And so they need to incentivize the private sector as much as possible to do certain things. So I don't think we're going to see that. I think in some discrete areas, Europe is probably going to move faster than us and have an impact globally.
Is that okay?
Well, it depends on what your views are. I think we'll see some action out of Europe on intellectual property that is going to have cross-border impact before we may act. Where the federal government in the United States should be concerned, though, is that states are moving ahead. Connecticut is moving ahead. California is moving ahead. There are hundreds of AI bills that have been introduced in the past 2 sessions in states, and a couple of them are very comprehensive, like the Connecticut one, a Colorado one, California one. And so we could have a patchwork that is going to be way more complex than the patchwork we've experienced in privacy.
I mean, this is the same problem, though, right? It's you've got the Europeans driving something, you got the states driving something,
Yeah.
and the federal government feels the need to act because you don't
Yeah.
want 50 state laws. But to Katrina's point, right, you might, the consequences of doing the wrong thing and getting this wrong could be hugely detrimental to innovation and to our national economic security, right? So I mean, this is a hard area. I did promise the audience I'd turn to them for questions, so let me just see if there's some questions in the audience. Sunil? Yeah.
All right, so we set up this contrast between speed and guardrails, regulation, whatever. I see the way I would look at it is that what enables you to drive a car fast is not the engine but the brakes. What differentiates the Autobahn from the Beltway? Rules and guardrails and very clear parameters around how you're supposed to drive, and you can drive much faster, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's an opportunity to allow them to work in parallel rather than.
So have the Autobahn and the Beltway? Have the Ferrari and the I don't know, Chevy?
Or to have, so there was a use case that you were bringing forward that I think we're conflating analysis and decision prep with
Okay.
action.
Okay.
So drones and what you can do with autonomous killer drones is more on the action side.
Okay.
Whereas a lot of work I think Katrina was talking about on the total side is more around analysis and decision prep. If there is a point where there is an action that's going to be taken, then it seems like one of the major guardrails that we should have is, let's have a human in the loop to make
Yep.
that
Yep.
decision, right?
Yeah.
And that's the Beltway maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with your approach. I don't think regulation and innovation are inconsistent. It just depends on, what type of regulation are we talking about. I think we need, I think it's a good thing that we have seatbelts and airbags in cars, and that there are speed limits and stoplights. Could you imagine an intersection with no stoplights or stop signs? I mean, it would be a mess.
It'd be like driving in Egypt.
We're India. Crazy.
So I don't think they're inconsistent, but you're right. Human in the loop remains a fundamental principle. Human-machine teaming.
Well, can I ask you a question about that? So, and I realize I said I go to the audience, but human in the loop only works so long as our adversary doesn't continue to do human in the loop too. What happens when China, Russia, Iran, North Korea says we're going full autonomous? It's going to make decisions fast. Now you got to respond in that same time frame, and humans can't be in the loop. They might be on the loop, might be able to step in and stop. Do we worry about that scenario?
That's a concern.
All right.
I don't have an answer to that.
All right. Katrina, do you want to walk into this train wreck? No. All right. Good. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Here at the front.
I'll just make a comment on that is, I think if we get to that point, we're going to face nuclear devastation. Won't be platform. So I guess we won't have to care anymore.
Problem solved.
So exactly. But I'm currently taking a course at GMU that talks about the dangers in AI. And so for 13 weeks, we talked about all the dangers.
Yeah.
It's just a dangerous course?
It's-
Tell me who your
I'm
professor is.
telling
I
you.
want to talk to that
I'm
professor.
telling
We need
you,
to talk about the
this
benefits.
is a real thing.
This is crazy.
But one of the things that does strike me as kind of scary is the Internet of Things, or everything's connected to the internet.
Yeah.
At what point does it feed into AI? Can it get skimmed? Can it enter that?
I mean, everything is already, so part of me is like, yes, I take that I'm trained as like a person in the defense enterprise to think, yes, everything is scary. And then I'm like, what exactly are we worried about? That like somebody's going to be able to remotely turn on your microwave? Like that doesn't actually worry me that
Well,
much.
insurance companies are sold information by our
Yep.
car companies.
I mean,
while
but
we're driving.
most of what we see is what the internet already enables, just maybe slightly faster. You know what I mean? Like I
Maybe
don't-
better.
Yeah, but like, I wrestle a lot with the premise. Yes, there are scary things, but one of the things that I spend a lot of my time thinking about is all the ways that this technology is also going to enhance our ability to respond to those scary things. And so like, we are doing that today in OpenAI. I mean, we use our tools in our, in our cybersecurity approach, and we are one of the most targeted companies, I would say, in the world, probably. And we are having tremendous success at that. So yeah, it's yes and, right?
So, it's funny you say that because we had an event with Congressman Ober Nolte and Royal Hanson from Google, and Royal made the same point, which is that in his view, and I mentioned your thoughts on this, that actually cybersecurity defenders are going to be advantaged over attackers with the advent of AI and generative AI. Is that how you see it as
I
well?
think the bar is going to be higher to be a successful bad actor in the cyberspace.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the potential for cyber defense is extraordinary, and I think that also points to why the concern that you raise, I think, is more speculative at this point, because we do have barriers up between different types of data sets and different types of machines. That's why we have cyber protection. Otherwise, everything would be free. And we do have rules around privacy and safety, and I think those are really important.
But there is one thing, though, that I think is worth pulling the thread on it, because I don't want to dismiss, even though I think that we should orient a bit more toward opportunity than the current conversation tends to orient us.
Towards opportunity, I think.
Yeah. I do think one area that I worry about and that our company worries about is persuasion and the ability of these tools to get after, some people call it foreign malign influence. That's how they...
Political,
or
narrative.
It doesn't have to be political, but just persuasion, even if it's commercial, you really need to buy this thing. There's the persuasive ability of these technologies is something that we need to develop science around. At our company, I can't speak to everybody else's, but we have an MIT professor by the name of Dr. Alexander Madri. I spend a lot of time with him talking about how his team is building the science around what these models can do. We have a framework around preparedness, and what we mean when we say preparedness is the world's preparedness for what the tools and technologies are going to be able to do. And we look at various types of risk that they might pose: bio, cyber, nuclear, persuasion. And we have a methodology for analyzing, what each new frontier model is going to be capable of. And then we have thresholds for whether we release those models or not, depending on the risk they pose and whether those risks can be satisfactorily mitigated.
Internally, you have
Internally. And it's a really, it's funny, when I came into the company from where I come from, I was like, well, that's a really sensible approach. And people were like, no, this is radical. We are in a company. Companies don't decide we've built something with tremendous commercial capacity and we're going to shelve it until we can figure, that's actually a transformative way of doing things. And you see that play out with our Sora model. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it's our text to video. If you haven't seen it, it's super fascinating. With a tiny
We're all
little...
waiting to get it. When do we get it?
Not until it's safe. That's the answer.
So you're going to tease us all these amazing videos.
We're going to tell you that
walk through cities and I can't use it.
Yes, we have had the technological breakthrough, but we have to do the work, and that means putting it in the hands of some trusted people to really red team what we're... you are not a trusted agent.
I will red team.
But I mean, look, that is not something that historically companies in the tech space have done. And
the opposite.
The opposite.
Right?
And I don't say, I think OpenAI has been a leader on this, and I'm really proud of that. But I also give credit to a lot of the other tech companies who you're seeing make similar decisions and have similar types of frameworks. We are all trying to get it right. And part of that answer, I don't know the whole answer, but part of that answer is not just throwing stuff out into the ether. It's figuring out what it can do first.
I agree with that. I think the whole area of malign influence, misinformation, deepfakes there are concerns around there. We don't have antidotes to all of that out there. There's not an antidote to deepfakes. There's a lot of different techniques out there to try to address them. But I think this goes to the idea of companies need to be responsible. And AI is going to make mistakes. And if the mistakes are prevalent enough, they need to address them.
It'll undermine trust. It'll undermine trust and adoption,
Yeah,
right?
That's the key. Trust is really important.
Yeah.
I think being upfront about that is useful.
Yeah. So I see a question in the back, right here in the front, then over here, then there. So I've got 4 questions in the back. Yes, sir.
With the 2024 election looming, you mentioned persuasion. Is the infrastructure companies, guardrails, whatever legislation may happen or may not happen, is it ready for the 2024 election? There's only a few months left.
I'm not sure we're ready for the 2024 elections, much less AI, but yeah.
If that's one of your major concerns, I would imagine
that's
that's
good.
maybe a proof point to win that concern.
Yeah, I'm going to pass on this question.
Karina?
have the information.
I wouldn't go so far as to say, I would be suspect of anyone saying we're ready. What I will absolutely say is that both inside of my company, but also other companies, and inside of the federal government, there's a lot of really good work happening on this.
And people are hyper aware of the problem.
Hyper aware, but also doing really good work. I mean, we sat down with Jen Easterly, the director of the cybersecurity, CISA, Cybersecurity and
Cyber Infrastructure
Security Agency, to talk about election security, among other things, recently. And I know they're talking with other companies to try to just understand what frontier models are coming up and what to expect. We have an election security lead at OpenAI who's focusing specifically on that, and I'm bringing her out here later, I guess next month.
We're happy to do an event on election security if you want to.
But I mean, our goal is to really educate and help the federal government figure out what we are doing, what we can't do, what the science is, so that they can make better informed decisions about how they're going to respond, and what they're going to do. So I actually, when I look at that, it gives me, I don't want to get overly optimistic about things. Look, there's unknown unknowns, and I think we have to remain very vigilant, but it's, I was very involved in the election security around 2018 when I was at DOJ and working with the Foreign Influence Task Force at the FBI, and we were just figuring out how to do some of that stuff. When I look at where we are now and the level of information sharing and the maturity of some of the structures with the private industry that have emerged over this time frame, it makes me a bit more hopeful that we're more ready than certainly we were a few years ago.
So a lot of people talk about the deep fake problem. Can AI help us figure out what a deep fake is versus?
It can, yeah. I mean, it can assess frames and figure.
Yeah, it can. I think there's nothing at scale that can do that.
Yeah.
So there's nothing that really is operable.
Why not
at scale?
All right.
I can't answer that.
Now we got an
That's a
OpenAI
technical
problem
one,
to solve, or
but I would
Google
say
Gemini problem to solve, or
one of the interesting things,
Cohere,
people are
Anthropic.
talking a lot more about misinformation around the election and the concerns there now than before, and potentially it's easier to do, easier to do at scale because of AI, but more people are aware of it.
Cool.
And I mean, this is what you said.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Versus 2018.
Yes. The more we know that that's a narrative pushed by the Russians or the Chinese, the better off we're going to be.
Some people don't care,
Okay, and that's fine. Let's
right.
write those people. Right. Okay. So yes, ma'am, in the front.
Yeah, I think we go to the phrase human in the loop as a sort of comforting factor. That's going to, prevent us from being eaten alive. How I'm more concerned about the human outside the loop, in the sense of this is really, when you sort of calm down all the energy and hype, a tool. It's just another tool.
It's not a replacement, you mean?
It needs to be managed, is what I mean, by humans that are thinking, they're looking at that loop, they're assessing where that loop fits in a larger operative system. And I just hear it being sort of reversed, where yes, we'll have some humans in that loop, if you take my name, but it's like, no, is somebody saying, do we need this for that? Is this a good thing, in this arena? For example, I don't believe we do have first advantage. I think we have equal advantage in terms of technology development, but we're in a different world now. And so there's some cooperation. It's not all going to be competitive. And so I'm wondering what you're thinking about that is in terms of both policy and education. In other words, people that approach this with independent critical thinking and are not sort of swept away from, let's get on this hype cycle and ride it till we hit the beach and then go back and hit the next one. Who is kind of keeping a level head about this? And just to finish up, to enhance the question a little, I'm fascinated by your title as Head of National Security Policy and Partnerships at OpenAI. It makes me think, is OpenAI determining our national security policy now? And so that's a bit of a provocative question. But again, it's another question like, Is somebody stepping outside and saying, love OpenAI, love all these cool little things we're seeing now, we can plan our vacations and ask a question. But is somebody really looking at a larger, because I do think our competitors / adversaries maybe be taking a more holistic view to this.
Yeah. So Katrina, you sort of raised this earlier when you said it's not a substitute for human engagement or human intellect. So tell us a little more about that, and let's clarify whether in fact you're setting national security policy for the nation at OpenAI. Let's just clear that one up.
You guys missed the part earlier where I said the longer your title is, the less important you really are. Like the really truly important people have very short titles.
CEO.
CEO, yeah. Owner. What I would say is there absolutely are some really good, there's some good thought leadership that's happening totally outside. And I would point you to the executive order, which I think does a really good job. It carves out national security use cases and guardrails around defense and intelligence applications.
The executive order, did you say?
Yeah,
the presidential executive order?
Yes.
That's right. But there is, in the executive order, it reserves for a follow-on national security memorandum some of the more sensitive aspects because they needed more time to get that right.
Which I hear they're going to make in part public. It's going to be partially
Oh,
classified
really?
and partially
I
unclassified.
have not heard that yet.
Yeah.
I've been asking a little bit about what form it's going to take, but what I do know is that they're working on that now. The whole national security enterprise is, and I expected to roll out sometime later this summer.
Yeah.
And that's happening totally independently of any individual company or and they are trying to get at some of these questions. And I know I will, and folks in roles like mine will be looking with interest. I think it will be a standard-setting kind of policy document, and I do hope that some of it can be publicly shared so that you probably won't be able to see all of it, I'm
Right,
sure,
no doubt,
but I think it'll be important for the world to understand where the United States is drawing those lines. I absolutely am not making national security policy for the federal government in my role, but what I am doing is making policy on how our company is going to allow our tools to be used, which gets at the point that you were making about companies being responsible. Our company currently has policy that prohibits the use of our tools for the development or use of weapons to injure others or to harm property.
Even with governments?
Yeah.
Really?
Absolutely. And so, that is why the use cases that we're steering the national security community towards are ones that don't touch on those issues. And
you're an American company, right?
I absolutely know we're an American company, but I
to help defend the system that's ours?
Absolutely committed to helping the United States in every way we can, but I also think that some of this reflects the maturity of the tools themselves. Like, the tools are not appropriate for use in weapons development today. And the folks who are trying to sell them for those purposes, I would raise a couple of eyebrows about that. I think we have a lot of responsibility to get this right for trust, for a whole bunch of reasons. And it's not the case, to your point, that we should just be going full steam ahead regardless of the consequences.
Can I just make a point on this? So there's companies that engage with the national security community, they need to be thinking about exactly the sorts of things that Katrina mentioned. But the other thing is today, especially the larger companies, they have a national security function, even though it's not delegated to them by the government and they are not state actors. But think about the issue of foreign malign influence. The place where that touches people is not in some classified DoD network. It is on the social media platforms and the other platforms that are used by millions of people around the country. And so there is a government interest in making sure that there is security there, cybersecurity and other forms of security. These platforms are essentially, from a broader perspective, part of our national security.
They're part of our critical infrastructure, which is why.
And that is absolutely true. And so they need to be thinking about these things. They need to be interfacing with the government.
So I have two last people, and I know we're a little over time, so folks, if you need to leave, we'll go a few minutes over since we started a few minutes late, so I will get to the last questions. Yes, please, here in the front.
Thank you so much. I'm Kelsey Frierson. I'm an AI fellow with Cinder Thune. Something that I've thought a lot about lately is I think oftentimes red teaming or auditing is thrown out as kind of like that's the answer to all of our safety problems. But the exact examples that you guys were giving earlier around AI being used as like cyber defense, like I think that there's, like if we're red teaming, like can AI find like 0-day vulnerabilities? Like if the answer is yes in the red teaming, does that mean like it's unsafe? Or does that mean, oh look, like the AI can find 0-day vulns to then go ahead and patch those?
Yeah.
So I think I'm trying to wrap my head around, and especially as we're looking at like Congress like potentially requiring auditing on certain like threshold of systems, what are we auditing for if like the same capabilities that would make these like a kind of impactful offensive weapon could also make them more useful in
For defense.
defensive
Yeah.
It's a great
capacity as
question.
well.
Yeah.
No, it is a good question. The way I would really answer that is that I would want you to sit down and talk to our preparedness team, because they're the ones who actually are doing that work. And they, what I would say is that they absolutely, like, we're not, the methodology that we've developed wouldn't say, oh, this is unsafe, and not talk about the mitigation side.
Yeah.
The mitigation side is part of the methodology, so I think there's a framework for thinking about how you wrestle with that. But I think that I basically would say you want to get a little bit more technical in thinking about that, because to the point that you're raising, you want to get it right. You don't want to require something that doesn't make any sense or is impossible to implement. But on the same, so calibrating that, I think, is really important.
Great. Last question back here. Yes, you, sir.
I just want to go back to something that you started with, Katrina, which is how the internet changed people's relationship with information, data. We used to use encyclopedias, and we had Google, and it would give us a lot more information than we then had to distill, and we could make our own decisions about that. With AI, it does that second step for you. It finds the information and distills it for you. I also think it's kind of odd that, but it's a reality, that a lot of people making policy don't use the tools at all.
Yeah.
And they don't use them because either they don't understand them or they don't trust them. So one of the things we had in the early days with Google is all the information is laid out, you make your own choices. With AI, you've got an algorithm and you've got a learning set. When you apply the algorithm to the learning set, the training and the testing, then you have a model. But nobody knows what that learning set was, so nobody can distill whether or not it's accurate. And we have the phenomenon of hallucination, so the output spits out stuff. We don't know if it's real, we don't know if it's not, until we go and look for ourselves. Virtually every framework or set of values related to AI that's been published talks about, you want transparency and explainability. And they usually focus on the algorithm, but I think the algorithm, no one will ever understand it. You can dumb it down all you want. I think an explanation of an algorithm will be about as useful as a click-through licensing agreement on software. We all see them, nobody reads them because it's too complicated.
Right.
But understanding the data, where did this learning set come from? Can we trust it? Are we violating people's intellectual property? Is there sensitive information? Are there things that can be done to describe the learning set that's used in a model that would encourage people to trust it?
Yeah.
And they would feel more comfortable. I mean, I completely agree that everybody should use it, but a lot of people don't because they don't trust it. So I'm looking for ways to build trust so that we can elevate it.
So what about that, Katrina? I mean, Paul, you want to go first?
No, it's a great question. The AI models are never going to be fully explainable. And if you look under the hood and look at all the data, the trained data, and even understand the model weights, you're never going to get to a point of accuracy. But there are a lot of efforts to do this, and there's a lot of voluntary efforts to, developing model cards, for example. I think.
Sorry, maybe you can explain what a model card is.
Imagine like a trading card but it's longer, that talks about the size of the data set, provides some description of the algorithm, what the purpose is, what the limitations are, whether there are any policies built into the training, like, we won't allow people to look for how to make chemical or biological weapons, things of that nature. It may provide a sense of the sources of data that's used, which on these massive large language models is usually hard to summarize. But So there's a number of measures like that I think, companies realize that trust is essential. And, the companies that are building these also want people to use them. And they realize they're not going to use them if they don't trust them, if they don't
Adoption
have
matters.
some adoption really matters. And I've seen, in OpenAI over the past couple of years, a lot more effort to try to, develop that kind of public trust and provide more information about its data sets. And likewise with other companies that are behind these big
And
models.
Katrina, you sort of suggested that maybe this year we might see a little more of that. Do you want to give us any more granularity on what you might do there?
I mean, I'll
I'm
tell
not trying to
you-
make you make news,
No,
but
no,
we'll take
I mean-
it if you will.
One of the things that I like to do when part of the solution to the problem is in how you structure the ask that
Yeah,
you're making.
tell it
of
to
the
give you
system.
citations.
Tell it to give you citations. Tell it to give you what is it relying on. You can tell it to rely more heavily on something else. You can build your own GPT where you train it. You sort of customize it by training it on
Yeah.
data that you choose. You could say, for example, if you worked in the Department of Defense and let's say you were in OSD policy and you were like, I want you to train on every policy memo that we've ever developed and then I want to ask you questions based on that information.
Just that data
You
set.
can do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So some of the answer is, I think, there. But the other thing I'll leave you with, and I don't know, hopefully this isn't even more terrifying, humans have the same problem. When we ask a person something and they give us an answer, we don't have fidelity on exactly how they arrived at it or what information they relied upon. And I think there's just a little, but yet we still trust people. There are other indicia of reliability that we get in working with people. And I think we're going to have to apply some of those same types of principles because, people are enigmatic too. People, we may not call it a hallucination, but people do unexpected things that we didn't.
And make up stuff
and
all the
make up
time.
stuff all the time. And we have figured out as a society how to live with that and adapt to it and sort of function nonetheless. So I try not to get too hung up on that because I just think that for every problem we identify, there's like a corresponding solution. And so to your point, don't plow ahead all the way straight to the most dangerous thing, but let's incrementally start to noodle on these problems together.
So thanks all for being here. I know we've gone way over, really appreciate it. Before I wrap up, I just want to share a little bit more about this next series of 5 private off the record senior staff sessions we'll have. This is the first of the public events, but we're aiming this at chiefs of staff, LDs, AI fellows, and national security advisors. Each discussion session will be led by 1 to 2 AI experts, and we'll start at the end of May. So please do sign up with a QR code. Have your folks in your offices do that as well. And in addition to these events, we'll also be releasing our first series of Control F, which will be our new podcast on emerging technologies and game-changing technologies. So please keep your eye out for that as well. Thanks everybody for coming. Have a great afternoon. And thanks to you guys for being here.
Yeah, thanks. Good discussion. I like Control F.